Happy holidays from all of us at Bronco Studios Live. With college football chaos at an all-time high today, we try to identify some potential solutions. Welcome inside Bronco Studios, presented by Ford. I'm your host, Jay Tust. Over the next hour, we're going to sit down with Boise State Director of Athletics, Jeremiah Dickey. About a week ago, Dickey took to social media to address some of college football's biggest issues. He laid it out in a post on X. He listed 12 different bullet points, and today we are going to go through each and every one of them. Joining us inside Bronco Studios is the man with this, we'll call it a 12-part plan, Jeremiah Dickey. And JD, through the holidays, everybody's at home right now, and I don't know, you're apparently not trying to find too much downtime because you're pretty vocal, I would say, on social media, over the last week or so. And I mean, honestly, just it feels like kind of putting your heart out there about what you want to see happen with college football. So we're going to dive into each 12 of these things, but why now? Why did you feel like now was the time to put this out there?
Yeah, first and foremost, Jay, Merry Christmas to Bronco Nation. I love you all and be safe over the holiday season. It used to be seasonal, and it's not. It's a continuation of one season ends, you're into the next, and football never really ends. And so I don't really think about the timing of when I put stuff out, per se. It probably is. I have a little more bandwidth right now, as we've gotten through the season. We all get a Christmas this year, which is I'm very grateful for our team and my family. And, it was top of mind, as I was following the CFP and what was being said about JMU and Tulane. It bothers me, Jay. And hopefully people see my heart in this, that I absolutely love being a Bronco, and I love being here, and I understand what I represent, and it's something bigger than myself. And I say that a lot. And when I see what's out there and the media driving these narratives, I'm not saying they're all wrong, but I also feel I have a seat at that table, and I'm gonna fight. I'm going to defend and I'm going to promote what I think is of value, and I'm going to call attention. I think now's the time for wartime generals. This isn't easy. I keep hearing across the industry that there's this level of hopelessness that's setting in. And I'm not going to call anyone out on that, but that's something that I think I've felt at various points over the last couple of years. And in typical fashion, when I get through the end of a season, I look in the mirror and say, what can I be better at? And how do I best represent our brand? And I'm so honored, Jay, to be here and to have that opportunity. I don't want to get 5-10 years from now and say shoulda, coulda, woulda. I want to fight the good fight, appropriately so, and that's hopefully not putting anyone in a bad position, but there is an uncomfortable position that I'm looking for, because that's where change occurs. And if I'm not being honest, if I'm not being transparent, if I'm not being authentic, then I'm not doing my job. And I understand there's risks that comes with that, but there's also a reward. And I'm going to continue to fight. I'm going to continue to speak my mind. Not everyone has to agree with what I say. But at minimum, my hope is that it leads to conversations like this, that people do engage and start thinking differently than what's got us here. We cannot live in insanity anymore.
I think that's the thing that kind of stood out to me about this, is that, I mean, you did get quite a few, people responding, a lot of engagement to those tweets, and you even see maybe some other athletic directors, dipping their foot in the pool of this conversation, and it feels like this kind of helped generate it. I'm assuming it's uncomfortable, but somebody's got to have this conversation and spark this thing. Let's just start really quick when we talk about the group of five and the college football playoff. And we have seen a number of national media members be very vocal, leading up to these college football playoffs about how the group of five should not be included in them. And it's just so funny because we look back in last year, Oregon gets blown out by Ohio State, and nobody really says anything about that. I guess one thing I will say in a sense that maybe some of the argument that they bring up is accurate is, when it comes to the value of these rosters, there is quite a big disparity. But in the spirit of college football, I mean, it's the David versus Goliath story that was basically, born on the blue when Boise State went and upset Oklahoma. It showed that anything's possible. And we can look at other upsets, App State over Michigan, like all these things that have made college football fun. It's embraced the spirit of college football. And to just shut that off seems like it would be wrong. It feels like we'd be watching a different sport.
Yeah, un-American. I agree with you. I think about us here, Jay, and the brand I'm so fortunate to lead. My job is to elevate it, but I didn't create it. Coach Pete and Hawk and Cutter, and there's so many others that, and those are just the head coaches, right? But there were so many people, Broncos that were a part of that. And I think about that Oklahoma game. Upsets do happen. And, and I understand, I'm more of a realist, than people probably want to give me credit for. But when the system is created to your disadvantage, and then people complain when it doesn't work out perfectly for them, that bothers me. I do believe there's a difference between us and, say, the NFL. If we're talking about college football, we're not made the same. We're similar, right? But we do have an academic mission. We do represent our communities and our states differently. We do have an alumni base. That's what made college football, college athletics fun. It was those moments in time that you remember, whether it's in the NCAA basketball tournament, and a 12 beats a 5 seed, which I think happens every year.
It almost happens every year. We've also seen the most unthinkable, and that's a 16 taking down a 1 before, right?
Correct. Yeah, I mean, Northern Illinois beat Notre Dame, a few years ago.
JD, that was last year.
Was it last year?
In South Bend. I know it does, but I think it's important to establish how recent that was, though.
Correct.
I mean, last year, Northern Illinois goes to South Bend and beats Notre Dame.
Correct. Well, and that's the thing, Jay. Like, let's be honest. We go into Oregon last year, previous season, and we're in that game. And a few mistakes here or there, and ultimately we don't win. But we were in that game. And this talk of, which I understand is for engagement. I get it. Like, a lot of what I put out is for engagement because it's important in telling your story. But saying that we're putting these kids at risk, say it's like, just be honest. Be honest so we can figure out the hand we're holding, so we can all adapt and fight for what's ultimately right. They're not being honest. Saying we're a AAA baseball team and, look, fine, let's go down that road. Major League Baseball supports those AAA teams. We have a lack of unity in our industry. And when you look at, and I find it funny, we're not good enough to be in, but we are you look at South Florida's quarterback. We're good enough for them to take our players. We're good enough for them to take our coaches. Like, you can't have it both ways. Let's be honest. Let's talk about it. Let's have these discussions. Let's present potential solutions, because what I can tell you right now is it's not working. The industry is even more chaotic as the money comes in through the front and back door. We've heard people talk about that. I put that in there too. Like, that is the reality that we're living. I get that we need to pay student athletes. I understand that. And there's still a lot there, and whether they're employees or not, and that's for people much smarter than I am. I know there's a lot to navigate, but let's be honest. Let's create some level of unity. Let's understand what we're trying to accomplish. It's not just throwing money into this whole black hole and hope that it gets better. If you're betting on hope, it's going to fail. We need to come together and figure this out. And whether that's the Power 2, because we talk a lot about Power 4, it's really two, other two.
The Big Ten and the SEC, then, Power 2.
And then there's probably a break in terms of Group of 5, of you have us and Memphis and Tulane and South Florida and San Diego State and Colorado State and Oregon State, whoever else, Washington State. There's another group, and then there's everyone else. Maybe it's unrealistic, Jay, that I think we can come up with a system that takes care of 136 FBS programs. But I believe we could. I believe if we actually had honest conversation, we got in the room and we curiously questioned, we could do this. And every step of that process, there are reasons not to. I get that. But if we can all start with what we're currently doing is not working, we can get somewhere. Right? The bottom is when you stop digging. And if we keep digging and throwing money at a problem that will continue, that is not sustainable, I can tell you what it's going to look like. It's failure. We have to have honest conversations. We have to embrace the suck of whatever that is. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect for a Boise State and it's going to be imperfect for an Alabama. It means everyone's going to have to give a little. We're going to have to figure this out. Fine. If they want to break away, then create promotion relegation. There's your path. And we create value, so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, I know we're going to dive into these here, but I want to go through them, each and every one of them very specifically, because you laid it out, 12 bullet points, and it's very clear.
In no particular order, by the way.
Okay. Real quick about the Oregon game, too, last year. I'd also like to bring up that game was actually tied with zeros on the clock. The field goal sails through the uprights after the game. So for 60 minutes, Boise State went toe-to-toe with a team that was obviously one of the best in college football last year, has a very expensive roster of football players. And one more thing that kind of hit me over the weekend, too, when it comes to that, is I see all these now rankings come out of the biggest Heisman snub of all time, and Ashton Genty's name is on all of them. Correct. Imagine if we lived in a world, right, where we shut off the group of five from something like this, and the deserved Heisman winner, again, I mean, my opinion for sure, but if you look at a lot of people out there that have thrown out, like, he should have won the Heisman last year, imagine Boise State being in the top 10, but because they were a group of five team, they're not in the playoff, and the Heisman Trophy winner is also not in the playoff. Like, I say it out loud. Like, I do think there are certain things that are like, that doesn't sound correct. Like, I think we can just say stuff out loud. And if it doesn't sound correct, let's find a solution. But, okay, so I think one of the first steps here in what you're saying is your first bullet point, FBS no longer under NCAA. NCAA takes a brunt of litigation. We can stop the bleeding. So elaborate.
We realize that football is different, and it can be monetized differently. Mm-hmm. We know here, for being honest, football pays for everything that we do. So let's create a path for football with unity, which ties into having a commissioner, and we already have postseason that's separate of the NCAA with the bowl season and CFP, and create something that makes sense, as opposed to the various conferences we have, and still with the NCAA with the guardrails that they supposedly have on how we operate. Mm-hmm. We know there are no guardrails right now, right? And that's a challenge. I'm not saying it's NCAA's fault. It's how they're set up. The industry has changed faster than those that lead it are willing to accept. We have to do something different, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion. And so why not break football away? Why not reset the table and create an infrastructure that makes sense? And I said it earlier with NFL. The NFL is about as perfect as you can possibly create a professional league, right? And now there's not the academic mission, and it's a lot less teams and whatever else, but there are some things that we could take away in regard to how their infrastructure is set up and the rules of engagement. You don't see a lot of cheating going on and I'll call it what it is. It's cheating. It depends on, your ethics and whether you see it that way or not. But what's happening is tampering. What's happening is the money's coming in the front door and the back door, as we said. There are specific rules in the NFL, and sometimes it rises and teams get in trouble. They get draft picks taken away. They get fined ridiculous amounts of money. You don't see it at the level that you see it here. Mm-hmm. And so I do think creating its own system, because it is different in terms of the amount of money that is coming in and what it represents, I feel like gives us a new lot on life. Like, it's like, all right, we know that we can't operate this way anymore. So what can we do? And maybe there are other solutions and suggestions, but to me, that seems like a reasonable path of creating a commissioner that oversees FBS. And then that leads to other questions. How many teams are included, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I do think that would be a path to go down. And I think there's reasons, and maybe it's my assumption, without saying too much in terms of the circles that I hear what's being said. And the NCAA has taken the brunt of a lot of the litigation. I understand there's risk, but the lawsuits are going to continue to happen, and it's because we're living insanity. So creating an infrastructure that works for everyone and having one leader and eliminating the NCAA, in how it's currently set up, seems like a reasonable path. But there are smarter people out there, Jay, that would tell me that wouldn't work, and I'd love to hear from them.
When you talk about tampering, obviously the transfer portal
Correct.
trying to get guys that are currently in one program to enter the transfer portal so that you might be able to negotiate with them to come to your school, or heck, even some of that negotiating probably happens even before they enter the transfer portal. And it's so funny because, my opinion, there used to be a ton of oversight by the NCAA, and I think we all could have agreed maybe a little bit too much. And now it doesn't seem like there's nearly enough. And it's unfortunate because I think we got a tremendous leader here in Spencer Danielson. And out in his postseason press conference, he comes out and says, hey, if other people want to do it, I'm not going to do it. Like, you talk about ethics and morals and doing things the right way, and he says, I'm committed to doing it this way. And it almost feels like those people are kind of being punished with the current setup because they're not willing to tamper or push the rules, or not even push the rules, violate the rules that should be in place. So number two, FBS commissioner, and you've kind of talked about this. How was that? How do you get to a point where you find the perfect FBS commissioner? Is that the university presidents? And I think the reason why I've asked myself this question this week of who is that person, because last year when we're down at the Fiesta Bowl, college football playoff, Boise State versus Penn State, and James Franklin, a very well-respected coach, obviously, in college football, he brings up a couple of names, Nick Saban and Chris Peterson. I mean, you're talking about the two of the absolute GOATs to ever coach. And Saban is probably the best to ever do it, right? But now you kind of even hear some of the things that he says on game day, and you're like, oh man, that's to benefit what you said is the power too, not necessarily protect like the spirit of football or build something that's sustainable for all 136 teams. It's almost like break off and everybody else can deal with, the table scraps. So I don't know, how do you get to that point where you find you can actually nominate an FBS commissioner?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not completely sure.
Yeah.
I think Coach Saban, I think Coach Pete, I think very highly of them. They are the GOATs, and there's probably a number of others that are out there. My intent on that, comment was to really push this narrative. We need unity. When you have the number of presidents, look, ADs, commissioners, all report to the presidents. When you have the number of cooks in the kitchen that we currently do, inherently you're going to have the setup that we currently have, which is everyone is going to do what's in their own best interest. And in some ways, that's the hand we're holding. To me, that's not a sustainable path forward. I think we need one voice. I think we need a leader. I think that ties into some of the other points, whether it's collective bargaining or, we have to, you go into this CFP season, and how many coaches had to make a choice whether to coach their team or not, meaning they had to turn down an opportunity. And I'm never going to judge anyone for doing what they feel is best for his family, specific to football. I'm not going to judge them, Jay. This stuff is hard, and everyone has to do what's best for themselves. But the fact that we can't get through a postseason, for that cycle to start, and how it ultimately is impacting these student athletes, which we are still here to serve, that should be the why. And I think we've forgotten that why. And so I'm not that smart, Jay. I look at it and say, all right, I can see the hand we're holding, and I can see that there's a number of different conferences, and within FBS, there's all these different levels. Why not have one leader? Why not figure out at a high level, how do we take care of the 136 schools that are represented in the FBS, and who is going to fight the battle that is overall best for all of those institutions versus what's best for me? And ultimately that maybe takes some of the power I have as an AD. Maybe it takes some of what the president's seat is at this table at this point in time. I don't know. But if we eliminate ego in this process and we truly look in the mirror and say, what do we want out of this? And maybe it's because, the reality's hitting me. I'm not young anymore, but I'm not old per se. God willing, Jay, I have another 20 years of this. And I love what I do. And there's a reason I chose college athletics versus going the professional route, after graduating, college. And everyone somewhat faces that decision if they want to work in athletics in general. And I believe we represent something bigger than ourselves. I believe that there's value in what we are doing for our communities, for the student athletes that we lead and serve. And, money's never been a driver for me. I want what's best, and I want to represent this team to the best of my ability. And so, yeah, I may have to give up a little bit in the process, and I'm okay with that. When I look at a sustainable model, starting with we all have to be under one umbrella, and we have to have a leader that is in charge of navigating some of the things. I look at the NFL, and Roger, like he is leading the NFL. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's perfect. I think he's done an unbelievable job. But like, to me, that makes sense as opposed to the conference commissioners, fighting this out in closed door sessions and who's actually included in those conversations. I think we need to be honest and at minimum, why wouldn't we? I mean, there's so much value in college football. Why wouldn't we have one leader, and whatever that term is, why wouldn't we? I think that's low-hanging fruit, but that also forces other conversations, who's included and who isn't. And that was a lot of the CFP conversation of, this past couple weeks of the two teams in the group of six getting in. And, I think it's going to force some of this out into the open. And that's hard. I get it. ADs, and whoever that person is, and obviously the infrastructure is going to matter and the overall setup. But it's like herding blind cats. You gotta start somewhere though. And if we can at least all admit what we're currently doing is not sustainable, and we keep digging so the hole gets bigger, then how do we do it?
That's something you see out on social media quite a bit. It just seems like a lot of people are overwhelmed and they'd like some guidelines. I think one of the next talking points you brought up is one of the more fascinating ones, and promotion and relegation. And that's something that might be a little foreign to American sports, in all honesty. But what is your idea there? And is it a concept you like, or do you have details? I mean, like, where would the divide be and things like that?
I'm being realistic. When I look at what we're navigating currently and the conferences that maybe have more power than others, it's not that I'm not hearing them in terms of the value of their programs versus ours, and their the competitive excellence that we all expect. I think promotion relegation gives everyone a seat at the table. It forces and reinforces investment, into our programs, and whether that's institutional or from a donor standpoint, it makes every game of value. I would imagine there would be a lot of value from a meter rights standpoint, but I do think that's something that, as I sit here today, could I live with that they tell us, all right, we're going to take the top 50, and then the next, whatever the number is, if it's everyone, or then the next is going to have this opportunity. And based on your level of investment, based on your level of success, you're going to have the opportunity. It's going to force the top to continue to do the same. To me, that drives the competitiveness of our industry. Mike Walsh, a few years ago, him and I had talked about it, and it ended up gaining some traction, and then everyone's kind of forgotten about it. We proposed this, I think, 3 summers ago now. And, why not? If it works for professional soccer, why wouldn't we create something like that? That does, I wouldn't bet on hope, but that gives hope and gives you an opportunity to continue to elevate and to potentially be included, because that at least creates a path for us. Right now, there is no path other than behind closed doors. They determine our value. And that's really challenging. And there's reasons that teams have been moved up or maybe weren't included, whenever these conference realignment decisions were made over the course of time, which we've been navigating for a very long time. I remember as a kid when the Southwest Conference went away, and, as a Texas guy, so that isn't new to this, but, those were opportunities. It's like, all right, there has to be a better way. We've just continued to in the insanity, and, I don't know, like, why wouldn't promotion relegation work? If the reason is, well, we're never going to get presidents or institutions or that level of unity, we'll see to my first 2 comments. If we create something separate from the NCAA, and we have a leader in that space, and you create the infrastructure to support it, and you already have the CFP in terms of the postseason, and then you create this promotion relegation, there is always a solution. Is it going to be easy? No. But I can tell you right now, it's not easy. And we're feeling it, and I would say, I don't want to speak for all ADs, but most of the ADs that I talk to, Jay, aren't having fun right now. Like, it's a challenging time in our industry. And, most of us, though, have a different level of fight than maybe others, and we're willing to keep going, and those that aren't, you're seeing people get out, and I don't blame them. They've been doing this for a long time. These jobs are hard on a good day. But we got to create something that makes the most sense, that at minimum stops the bleeding, as I've said, and positions us for success in the future, that at minimum we create something that's sustainable, because what we're currently doing right now isn't.
I think it'd be an awesome idea. I think that it would be highly entertaining, 1 through 50, whatever it is, because if you are in the bottom half of that 50 and you feel like have had the luxury of being in a certain league just because you have been for a while, then you got to fight to stay in that league, and you got people coming for you to knock you out of that league. I think it'd be highly entertaining, just as entertaining as maybe the college football playoff at times.
Jay, and I said 50, but like split the difference, and whoever's in, and then the rest are fighting for those spots. And obviously there are a lot more details that we would have to dig into. But, I just, it ties into the narrative that I feel now, as a leader in this department, I can see why people would push back, because why would they want to run the risk of potentially being us?
Yeah.
Well, that's not a reason not to do it. To me, that goes back to whatever those great human qualities we all have: selfishness, ego. Obviously everyone wants their cake and eat it too. Seeing the writing on the wall, why not curiously question that model? Why not create something that benefits all? Why not fine, you think you have this bigger seat at the table, so be it. But then give us an opportunity, to at least have a path to also be a part of that. And I don't know. I think there's an opportunity there.
Next on the list, you talk about expanding the college football playoff. Now, they did that a few years ago. Is there a perfect number in your mind, and why? And I'll throw this in there too. We saw Dan Lanning even say this week. I mean, the Ducks are going to go play Texas Tech on a neutral site field, right? And he was saying, hey, I think that Tech they earn the right to have home field advantage, and it should be on a college campus. What are your thoughts on that? And do you have a perfect number for that CFP expansion in your eyes?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a perfect number. I think a lot of that is dependent upon promotion, relegation, and ultimately how we set up the playoff. And I look at the FCS, and I think they have a model that works, and with the number of teams that we represent, in our industry, and in the FBS specifically, there is a number in there, but it shouldn't be about how do we get more from our conference versus someone else. Let competition determine that, and that means we have to reset the table. And so, I don't know what the perfect number is, and I appreciate Coach Lanning. I agree. I love the college sites. Absolutely love it. I watched a little bit. I didn't watch all the games. I watched a little bit of that Oklahoma game, and ultimately they lost, but what an awesome experience, to create those memories. And, once again, I don't feel, we have to reinvent the wheel, outside of the Super Bowl, the championship, their home sites, why not do that? And, and I think that ties, people will say, well, these bowl games and the tradition and history, as an AD, I can't live in the past. You can't forget it, but we can't live in the past. We have to make decisions here and now, and you just hope yesterday's solution isn't today's problem, because no one's giving us an AD book for dummies, and saying just do these 10 things and you're going to be fine. No, this is hard stuff. We have to have adult conversations, and and there is a potential path. I know it's another point I had of what do we do with bowl games. And
well, let's just go there, because that is the next on the list. And you say move bowl games to 0 weeks, so out in front of the season, which also talks about, or would imply, rotating the college football calendar to actually align with these things. And, I just remember a point in time in my life where, I'd get out on Christmas break and I'd almost memorize the whole bowl schedule. And that is what I did on my Christmas break. But now that it just, the value of bowl games, it just seems to, it's not what it once was, right? Like players are opting out, coaches are opting out. I mean, it's not what it once was. Yeah. So what's your vision for there? And I also like that, Tanner Vallejo, who, by the way, was the defensive MVP of the 2014 Fiesta Bowl for the Broncos. Even you were interacting with him on Twitter, and he had questions about it.
Yeah. Once again, I'm not saying it's a perfect solution. At minimum, hopefully it gets people talking. Mm-hmm. We see what the bowls have become, and we got to be honest. If coaches are and maybe they don't have a choice, but they're not able to, in the CFP, much less, finish their seasons and because of the schedule and a portal and so on and so forth, then what does that mean for bowl games? And what is the true value of those bowl games? I do know they represent something in their communities. I come from El Paso, Texas. The Sun Bowl for many years, was the only game that was sold out. And there was value. It's a great experience. I volunteered when I was at UTEP, and there was value in terms of that experience. It's not the same anymore, and you look at whether it's transfer portal and people opting out and coaching changes and so on and so forth, the amount of money it's costing, and now that we are revenue sharing with our student athletes, it's a challenge, and I saw a couple teams, this year opt out. My guess is even though they were fined, so to speak, they probably saved money, and so why not make those games more valuable than they currently are? It doesn't mean taking them out of those communities. I do think that the traditional bowls and the Rose Bowl and the Fiesta Bowl and things like that you could potentially build in, and it's not going to be perfect. Maybe not all home sites. Maybe you wait, depending on how you expand the playoff, and then you have those bowl games that have been around for decades upon decades and have a lot of value. There are a lot of bowls. We just went to the Potato Bowl yesterday, and great experience. But think about that being on a 0 week and it being a value. Now, in our case, those are two Pac-12 teams in the future. But I think about us playing Washington and how cool that would have been to play that at the beginning of a season. And obviously I got a lot of questions of like, well, what about the team that gets there? I get it, but it's not going to be perfect. Mm-hmm. We continue to try to fit a square peg in a round hole, and we're going to have some concessions. It's like, all right, there's going to be 1 year that's maybe uncomfortable, but move those games to the beginning of the year. It forces the Power Four currently to play maybe I say we're a Power Five, but based on how they define us, that we're a group of six. It forces a Washington to play us, and we play in a neutral site game. And, it gives our fan bases time to buy tickets and plan travel.
Yeah, 9 months to figure that out versus in some cases like 9 days, which it wasn't even 9 days this year, trying to figure out how to get to the LA Bowl for Boise State.
Correct. And you think about like what we're asking our fans to do. I do believe they have a seat at this table, and believe me, I love the bowl season. It just, if we're being honest, it doesn't have the value it used to, because of the CFP and ultimately, and that's fine. I'm in favor of a playoff. I want that. Then it feels more like the NIT, and there's nothing against it, but can we make it better? Mm-hmm. Can we provide more value? Would it increase and improve viewership if Boise State's playing Washington, the last week of August or whatever the schedule is, whatever the 0 week date is? And would it drive more value? Would it give data points to say, oh yeah, they can compete? That Oregon game was important to us in terms of our CFP run. Yep. So, it's getting harder to schedule Power Four opponents, especially, home and home, mm-hmm. And that's why you've seen us go to Notre Dame and you're seeing us go to Oregon next year. And so why not curiously question that? It doesn't mean that the communities don't have value. I love those communities. All these bowls represent great places. I want them to have that value. I've heard everything from, in terms of some of the comments, it's going to be too hot. whatever. Like, it's going to be too hot. It's going to be too cold.
I'd rather it be too hot than too cold and rainy, right? I'm okay with that.
Let's create something that continues to have value, continues to hold on to that tradition and history that some of these games represent. And, but I also sit here and look at a system where how many teams, become bowl eligible. We're rewarding 6 and 6. Look, I represent an institution that's been bowl eligible 28 straight years. Going to a bowl game is important, but I also, I'm not everyone gets a trophy guy. Let's define the expectations, define the rules, and those that win and compete at the highest level should be benefited in the process.
Next up, Unite media rights. And media rights, they're the ones that have a lot of say in conference realignment and all this stuff. So how would you pull that off?
So once again, I look at the NFL model, and at some point in time, and I don't have my notes in front of me, but the NFL made a decision that they were going to unite, and the Green Bay Packers are different than the New York Giants or Dallas Cowboys and some of the big market teams, but they bet on themselves and ultimately created a tremendous amount of value for their league. I love Cody Campbell's idea, and and I think there are a lot of moving pieces to it, obviously, and. When I think about the Sports Broadcast Act of '62 and nothing I've presented or suggested, I should say, is perfect. And I know there are a number of hurdles and challenges, but the longer we wait to accept the reality, the harder it's going to be. And like most things in life, Jay, if we do the work on the front end, it's a lot of work. It will be better on the back end. That's the legacy that I think about a lot of times. Did I do everything I possibly could, to leave something better than I found it? And, I think about uniting media rights. If we can create more value and it creates more dollars for these programs, why wouldn't we do it? That's the question. I always go back, why not? That's how I start every conversation with our staff, as why not? Give me reasons why this should work or shouldn't work. And then let's do what's best. And, and the only thing I can come back to is it maybe eliminates a perceived competitive advantage, and maybe not perceived, maybe reality, a competitive advantage some have over others. That's not a reason not to do it. Come up with, there may be others. There's federal legislation, there's maybe state, there's a ton of, I'm not suggesting anything easy, but at minimum, we got to talk about it. At minimum, we have to think through it. And Cody and his team have done a ton of work, and obviously he's been public about it, and it makes a lot of sense to me. I
feel like you've kind of talked the talk and walked the walk of that too, because, when Boise State initially joined the Mountain West, they were supposed to receive a special, TV deal compared to everybody else. And you actually, at one point in time, talked about even walking that back to kind of level the playing field and hopefully all boats would rise. Is that an example of that?
That's absolutely an example. And
that's well before this conversation ever even happened.
And Jay, that's every point ties into the next point. Why we need unity, why we need one leader, why we need one organization, and whatever that looks like. We cannot continue to do what's best for us and expect it to be best for all. And what is our ultimate goal in this? It's to create my why is still to serve our staff, our student athletes, and our supporters, and to prepare these student athletes for life. There is a way to continue to do that if we somehow unite. And I understand that's challenging, but every leader in the industry needs to look in the mirror and say, why am I pushing what I'm pushing? I'm not pushing it for, I got a lot of comments. I'm not pushing it for personal gain, Jay. And most things that people come back at me on, I can face head on, and there's a lot of uncomfortable conversation, that needs to be had. But, if I put everyone else ahead of what's best for me and us, and ultimately can create something that is best for our industry and best for how we serve, why shouldn't we run out those ground balls? Why shouldn't we curiously question? Because what I can tell you, and I've yet to hear anyone push back on this, what we're doing is not sustainable, and it is the definition of insanity, and that bothers me. I can live with failure. I can't live with insanity.
Well, I think the definition of insanity also best sums up the transfer portal era. And, you suggest moving the transfer portal to the end of spring. And I think we made a big step in now only having one transfer portal for football. I think it was a huge step that we took this year. Why the end of spring?
Part of it was, and maybe me curiously questioning, I'm seeing these coaches having to make decisions in terms of the hiring cycle and whether or not they can be with their teams and whether or not the ADs and fan bases want them with their teams. And I think that's a challenging situation. The other piece, Jay, is the academic mission still matters to me. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe people say it shouldn't matter, but that's what differentiates us. We're not the NFL, and at some point the NFL is going to start curiously questioning what we're doing. We're impacting their pipeline, and so why not create something that takes into account the academic mission and the academic semesters. And truly get commitments, which ties into collective bargaining. I understand there's potential things that we're going to have to navigate in that too, but we move it to the end of spring. That doesn't, that then allows some level of runway to then go through a hiring cycle. I understand the signing day and when that is in December, maybe that needs to be curiously questioned, but to get a little more runway, to provide some coverage for us. Because decisions, you're seeing coaches get fired and much earlier in the process. There's a reason. ADs aren't heartless. They're seeing the writing on the wall. They have to make quick decisions because you have signing day coming up. You have transfer portal coming up. You have to continue to go. You can never stop. Well, move everything.
Yep.
And you have your team and there's development cycle and you'd have to figure out OTAs or spring ball. And I know I suggested maybe move spring ball to July. I look at the NFL model, and I'm not saying it's perfect for us, but it works for them. And what can we pick and choose that is of value? And, and keeping our guys here, keeping them in school, allowing them to leave when as eligible student athletes because the portal is at the end of the spring. Maybe create some loyalty and memories and whatever else. I understand this is a free market system. Like they can leave whenever they want. For the most part, there's window openings. But once again, I feel we're living insanity. I don't like what's currently happening. You've heard some coaches talk about it, the tampering that's going on. And forcing these student athletes to make decisions because of personal health. It's a physical sport, and and the opt-outs, and it's like there has to be a model that will work. I'm not saying it's easy. Once again, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I do think moving the portal to the end of the spring would maybe create some opportunities for us.
You also talk about moving spring ball to July. That was my initial question. If you move the portal after spring, then you already go through spring ball with that roster, but that wouldn't necessarily be the case because now you just almost mimic what the NFL does where you probably have some type of OTAs in that time frame, and then your true spring ball would be in the middle of summer, and that would be your lead up to the actual season.
Yeah, and maybe you still do spring ball. I mean, I'm not saying that's not an option, and then you figure out who your team is, and the student athletes know whether they're going to play or not, and that's a maybe a rabbit hole. Like I don't like what we're teaching our student athletes. When the going gets tough, we leave. And I'm not saying all student athletes. I'm not trying to put everyone into a box here, but that's something that I was taught as a kid. When the going gets tough, work harder. And keep going. And I think we're missing that lesson. But all to say, maybe you have spring ball. Maybe everyone knows who your depth chart is and where people are slotted. And it's like, all right, I want to go play. So be it. We've already opened that door in Pandora's box. It's not changing. And, and maybe you then, start with OTAs in the summer. I mean, our guys are here in the summer. They're working out in the summer, like what is, why wouldn't it work? Once again, why not? Why not?
We talk about collective bargaining, and I think another way to talk about this is like in order to achieve that, maybe you do need one voice and an FBS commissioner, and everybody talks about guardrails and things like that. And if you get to that point with collective bargaining, then maybe you do have some guardrails. What would it take to pull off collective bargaining? You also mentioned the NFL model and things like that. I mean, it would probably be hard to. If everyone got on board, it's probably hard to achieve collective bargaining by the kickoff of the 2026 season. It's probably going to take some time, right?
Oh yeah, Jay. And I mean, I'm way over my skis on it. Full transparency. I like the concept. I think it is something when you think about all the lawsuits and 5 for 5 and, I mean, there's student athletes that are getting 6, 7 years. Like, like to me, there is a better answer. There's a better solution. I know there's some things that we continue to talk about that I don't know what the answer is. Are they employees, not employees, and what does that look like? And I also know you collective bargaining, it could end up costing you more, but we see what people are willing to pay. We see that money's going in the front and in the back door. So why not get everyone at a table? And there are models out there. Athletes Org has put something out there, and I love Jim. I'm not saying that's the 100%, the absolute template we need to follow. But what Jim, and I do appreciate what he's doing, is he's trying to force a conversation, because to me, it's inevitable that we get to that point in time. I found it interesting that a lot of the people that pushed back on the collective bargaining were agents. Once again, everyone has to look in the mirror. Why do we want to do what we want to do? This isn't for personal gain for me and the vast majority, if not all, ADs out there. And I'm not speaking on behalf of any of them. It's coming from a very authentic, humbling, seat of, I just know what we're doing isn't working. And so why not curiously question that? Why not go down that road and at minimum have the conversation of what collective bargaining looks like and how we protect and promote our student athletes in the process. And that ties into my why. I truly want to impact them for the rest of their lives in a positive way. And that's something that we represent.
I feel like all three of these last bullet points almost kind of play into each other. You mentioned a true cap, no more money through the front and back door. And it's, Ed Orgeron, who won a national title at LSU, was recently on a podcast joking like, no, they always found a way for it to happen. The bag just came through the back door before this era began. You talk about, authentic NIL, which I think that's what everybody envisioned when NIL was, conceived. And now that's not necessarily what it is. And then finally, to be an agent, some type of certification process. And I think that there are probably a number of college agents that will push back on a lot of this stuff because it is so unregulated at this point in time. And sometimes I think it's unfair to student athletes. And, even to, Spencer Danielson's point, I think it ties into this at his end of the season press conference. He was saying, there are some of our guys that other schools might try to push into the portal and they say, we'll give you this. And then once you actually hit the portal, oh, that's not quite the deal that we told you were going to get. And there isn't that, communication, I guess, that should be, that needs to take place before those decisions are made. But I don't know. I just think that all three of those last talking points kind of all rope into each other.
Yeah, they do. I mean, free agency, how do we protect those that we serve? And, I think some of these student athletes are taken advantage of. We've experienced it here, and I do believe tampering is going on, and I do believe that it's us paying them, and then there's the brown paper bag, and we're not operating that way, but that was always the model, and let's be honest about it. I mean, you look at, in the past, that's exactly how recruiting was done in a way. And I appreciate someone like Spencer, you brought it up first. Like, we're going to do what's right. Just because everyone's doing it doesn't make it right. And maybe that's a competitive disadvantage, but I can sleep at night. Whatever sleep I do get, at least I can sleep at night knowing I'm doing the best I can and doing it the right way. There is no perfection in this, but we gotta protect our student athletes. And I'm not saying the agents shouldn't have a seat at that table in terms of the percentage they're getting. And I do believe the NFL model, like, there is a piece the agents get from the authentic NIL space. But the reality, Jay, is we are the authentic NIL. We are the ones, we created Bronco Pro for this. We have guys, our team is out there driving even more of these deals. I'm not necessarily in favor of that. It's the hand we're holding. We got to do it. And I love our kids, and I'm fortunate to have that opportunity for our team to be able to live that out in action. At the same time, to me, that's, let them handle that, and when you continue to chase your tail, like this is what ends up happening. There were decisions over the course of time where we probably could have gotten out in front of this. Paying student athletes. I remember when I first got in the industry, it was discussed then, and we're talking 20 years ago. We knew it was coming. We just didn't have the right leaders in the room that were, making the appropriate decisions at that point in time. And I'm not blaming anyone. Yesterday's solution, today's problem. Like, those are hard. I can't say if I was in that room that I would have said, "Oh no, let's just get to this now." And they prolonged the inevitable as long as they possibly could. Now we're paying these kids. Now we have authentic NIL that the departments are running. Now there's agents involved. The industry has 100% changed, and that creates challenges for us. We know tampering is going on. Our kids tell us, and the people aren't dumb. Like, it's kind of like the old days, you hear stories of leave your window rolled down and money's in your car. People are always going to find a way to cheat. They're always going to find a way to navigate the rules as they sit or as they're defined. And I want to create parameters and guardrails that truly protects the student athletes, that protects the institutions, and I want to do it to the best of our ability. And I'm not sure we've done it to the best of our ability. We just continue to do the same thing over and over, expecting different results. And now, we're not only, in some ways, like I joke with people, like it was easier when it was in a brown paper bag. Now it's both, and it's costing these institutions a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And that tells me that what we're doing isn't working.
Well, I think that everybody can agree college football needs a solution. It's chaotic right now.
Yeah.
And if they can get on that solution, I do think the future is bright for everybody involved. I'll get you out of here on this one, Jeremiah. When it comes to just this general conversation, what's the first step? What's like the first thing that would just be, to offer some encouragement that we're getting there?
I think the first step, and it's not to pat myself on the back, Jay, it's a lot of thought that I put into these things of how I'm showing up and truly representing the people that I serve. Being a leader is hard, and being a wartime general is even harder because certain things are sacrificed in the process. And that's something I'm still growing in, and in my mind, in my opinion, and I'm sure there were probably ADs who weren't overly happy with how vocal I'm being, but I think the first step is to be vocal, and call it what it is. And once again, not saying I have all the answers, and it's going to take a team. This is an imperfect system, and we do represent something bigger than ourselves, and we are having a positive impact on these kids. I see it. That's why senior days are so emotional for me. I love these guys, and I love our industry, and I want us to create something that can live beyond us. And in many ways we were left holding a bag that for many years we knew was coming. And now, fortunately for me, maybe unfortunate for others, that I'm not going to live in fear. I'm going to speak the truth, and at minimum I'm going to curiously question, and in hopes that it drives the next conversation. There are a number of things on that list, and I would say creating a certification process for agents, that seems to be low-hanging fruit. Maybe I'm missing something. Like I said, there were agents that they didn't necessarily like that suggestion. You got to ask why. I want to create something that is a value and that I can be proud of, because in many ways I'm not overly proud of what we've become. And so I'm doubling down, and I'm not going to live in fear. I know that impacts me. I know I'm going to take bullets. I know people are going to, I got called a number of things, and that's okay. No one said being a leader was going to be easy, and if I fell, I fell. I can live with that. Like I said before, I can't live with insanity. And so leaders need to step up, and you saw a number of ADs, and a number of people have reached out, and we can't be scared to be honest. We have to speak the truth, and we have to figure out solutions, and it's going to take a team. There are a lot of people that need to have a seat at that table.
Well, Jeremiah, we appreciate you joining us inside Bronco Studios. I'm going to conclude it with the bottom part of your tweet, and it says, "Reset the table. Our why is to prepare student athletes for life. Insanity isn't the solution. The bottom is when you stop digging. Keep digging.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Jay. I appreciate it. And thank you, Bronco Nation. Merry Christmas. Be safe again. And I love you guys. And go Broncos.
And with that, just a reminder, we are going to be back to our regularly scheduled programming coming up in the new year next week. In the meantime, both the Boise State men's and women's basketball teams are in action this week over at Extra Mile Arena. That's going to do it for now. From inside Broncos Studios, I'm Jay Tust.